Earlier this week, I thought yesterday, we interviewed from Canberra the chairman of the new ministerial task force to do with organised crime in this country and corruption. And he mentioned both organised crime and corruption in the same word and how they were interconnected, and that Associate Police Minister Casey Costello has put together this very distinguished panel to advise her on ways in which both might be combated in this country. Can I say that neither organised crime nor corruption are words that I think I associate with New Zealand? In other words, I've grown up, as you know, my childhood was in the 60s, my adolescence in the 70s, and the end of my university years at the start of the 80s, and then my political career started in that decade as well. And the very idea that New Zealand could be a corrupt place where organised crime would flourish seemed bizarre to me, and still rings almost alien to my concept of what New Zealand is and who New Zealanders are. But the next story probably even hangs me out there further. It makes me feel disassociated from the country in which I live, and I don't recognise the words as relating to New Zealand, and yet they are. They are the words sex trafficking and slavery in New Zealand. And I got to be honest with you, I would imagine there'd be an awful lot of people my age going, nah, it doesn't happen here. Nah, 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 no. But increasingly, over the last 2 or 3 years, cases have been highlighted both through our court system and by the Department of Immigration and by the government in general, but particularly by our next guest, that sex trafficking and slavery are becoming more common in this country, and that they are a problem that this country needs to address. Joining us to talk on this particular issue, spokesperson for ECPAT, Eleanor Parkes, joins us. Eleanor, thank you so much for joining us. You've heard the introduction, but can you explain to our listeners, first of all, ECPAT? Who are you? What do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. So ECPAT is an NGO based in New Zealand. We work to end child sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. And we're part of a broader movement, ECPAT International. So it's a network of just over 100 member organizations around the world, all with that shared goal, all around combating trafficking. And I think a lot of people in New Zealand would share your response in saying, what, but that doesn't happen here. That's not a word I associate with this country at all. So just to jump on that quickly, because this is huge for us at ECPAT.
Yeah.
When we're talking about trafficking, I can give you the rambly long definition, or we can engage in a discussion around how the New Zealand definition isn't really in line with the international definition. But let's just simplify it and say, when we're talking about child trafficking, like child sex trafficking, we are talking about sexual abuse, where there's also some kind of a transactional component. So something is being traded like money, and someone's benefiting from that. And I think when we put it in those terms, we can start to understand that maybe that would happen in New Zealand, because we all know that our child abuse rates are terrible here. Our sexual abuse rates are terrible here. So then it becomes not that much of a stretch to understand that if someone can abuse a child, then someone can take payment for abusing that child or pay to abuse a child. And so suddenly it becomes well within the realms of what we understand to be happening here in New Zealand, just by a new, bigger term.
So, but when you talk about sex trafficking, you're saying that there are people being brought into New Zealand, children being brought into New Zealand for the purpose of being utilised for the sexual abuse by adults.
Absolutely. We're also, to clarify, when we talk about trafficking, talking about domestic trafficking as well, because it doesn't have to have that international or border crossing component. So we also work on trafficking that's occurring here within New Zealand, children or young people being moved around the country and exploited within the country. But by its definition, it doesn't even have to have that movement. It's more around that transactional component and the intent. So we have to try and move away from those ideas that people hold of, people in Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe being moved around in the back of big trucks handcuffs and all of those kinds of images that come to mind that are so, I guess, embedded in our cultural understanding of trafficking because of like Hollywood movies and everything. But it doesn't really look that way, whether in New Zealand, whether we're talking domestic trafficking or international trafficking. And I know you're interested to talk about adoption, intercountry adoption as part of this. However it's looking in New Zealand, it usually isn't handcuffs and so on. It looks more like abuse. It looks like child abuse, or it can look like intimate partner violence. It really doesn't stand out. Same thing with that term organized crime. Trafficking certainly can have that really organized component to it, and there can be a number of different people involved in harboring the children or the people being trafficked, transporting them, all of, many different stages to it. But it usually doesn't look that way here. So we've got to be looking for the right thing. And that's part of the challenge in addressing this, I guess, is we're often looking for something quite different.
Well, I mean, the other thing is there are so few cases that comes before the courts to give us some sort of sensational degree or understanding of what the issue is. Can I just take you, though, to a story that was interesting to me, and it was to do with the Zirkus Circus, Z-I-R-K-A.
Yes.
Now, the Zirkus Circus is something, gosh, it's come to Cromwell. It's been all around New Zealand. They toured, and you are suggesting, well, I don't know if it has been suggested, that some of those entertainers, obviously very skilled young children, as young as 11, toured the country for years as acrobats before they were uplifted by authorities and returned to China. Now, that's in the case in New Zealand. Do we consider them as being trafficked as well?
Oh, I would definitely consider them as exploited, and I don't know whether that in the end came under the definition of trafficking here or not. I think there was a lot of discussion around that. One of the problems is that our definition of trafficking, child trafficking in New Zealand, doesn't match an international understanding of child trafficking. Particularly, there are questions around the use of coercion. And in New Zealand, to get a conviction through that uses our anti-trafficking legislation for children, you have to be able to prove that there was coercion there, which can be quite difficult in some cases with children, because often children don't need to be coerced. Often they don't consider themselves to be exploited or trafficked. They don't know any different. They haven't been tricked into it. They might have just been asked to do it. They might have been brought up with this as a sort of understanding of what is normal and what to expect. And so that is a real challenge with us here, and we do need our definitions to desperately be amended. You're quite right that we don't see these numbers in courts, and that's because if you do apply that anti-trafficking legislation in court, it's really difficult for it to stick. And so usually, even if everyone agrees it's a case of trafficking, almost always when you see it in the courts, there'll be lesser charges that they'll have gone with in the end, like assisting a minor into prostitution, if it's to do with sexual exploitation, child abuse, sexual abuse. So even in cases of trafficking, it still doesn't go before the courts as trafficking.
Okay. There is also the case that's been used by state media this week. I think actually it might have been last week, to do with the girl called Grace. Now, you'll be aware of it. I think you were interviewed for that program by Radio New Zealand. That's not her real name, but she was a 13-year-old girl who was brought to New Zealand and enslaved. But her abusers have never been charged with trafficking the gang. And Oranga Tamariki, although they said, oh, well, we might do something about it today, didn't actually do anything at the time. And she was used as an example of a girl who spoke very little English, had multiple injuries all over her body, grossly underweight, poor hygiene, head lice, exploited and neglected and cruelly treated. And we would all say that anybody that was involved in that should be in jail for a very, very long time. I would think that would be the average New Zealand response. I'm trying to get a handle on how common Grace is.
Yeah,